a black high school senior, walked into his Ivy League interview with a 4.3 GPA and a full scholarship offer, only to be mistaken for the janitor. When he corrected them, they laughed and canceled his interview on the spot. But what they didn't know, he'd secretly recorded everything. And by the time the footage hit the internet, it was already too late. Because the person he sent it to wasn't just his mentor. She was a US Senator. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The lecture hall smelled faintly of dry erase markers and polished wood. Morning light slanted in through the tall windows, casting long bars across rows of stiff oak desks. It was the kind of space built to make people feel small, especially freshmen. Everything in the room whispered, "Prove you belong here." Jalen Moore walked in 5 minutes early, as he always did. Not because he was eager, but because being early meant choices, like choosing the back row. He'd learned that lesson in high school. The front row invited questions. The middle brought attention. But the back gave him silence, space, and the chance to just exist, at least until someone noticed. He slipped into the last seat by the window, adjusted his black-rimmed glasses, and unpacked his laptop. Around him, students trickled in, most white, some Asian, a handful of international accents murmuring low hellos. No one looked twice at him, not yet. It was the first day of Calculus 3, a class not meant for the faint-hearted. Jalen had placed into it straight out of high school. His AP scores were nearly perfect, and he'd spent the summer buried in textbooks, tackling integration problems for fun. But he didn't talk about that. In fact, he didn't talk much at all. Then the door opened, and everything in the room shifted. Professor Richard Calloway walked in wearing a navy blazer, his graying beard trimmed with almost surgical precision. The room hushed. Calloway didn't command attention with noise. He exuded it. With a stack of papers under one arm, he moved to the podium like a judge, preparing to deliver a verdict. Jalen had read about him. National fellowships, published research, awards stacked higher than most professors' desks. A giant in the field. But Calloway's reputation carried whispers too. Words like demanding, merciless, and occasionally selective. No one said it outright. But the black upperclassmen had warned him, "Keep your head down, stay sharp. He picks favorites, and he picks them early." Calloway's eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Jalen. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his expression. Dismissive? Curious? It was gone too fast to name. "Welcome to Calculus 3, he said. His voice was smooth, practiced as if he'd given the same speech 100 times. "This class will not coddle you. It is the foundation for nearly every advanced concept you'll encounter in mathematics, physics, and engineering. If you're not ready, you'll fall behind quickly." He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. "You've each been given a diagnostic exam. This isn't for a grade, it's for me to see what I'm working with. You'll have 25 minutes. Begin." The papers were passed down each row. Jalen glanced through his 12 questions. Vector fields, multiple integrals, surface area under curves. Nothing he hadn't seen before. As pens began to scratch paper, Jalen leaned in, his brain slipping into gear. The room disappeared. He solved the first 3 problems in under 5 minutes. By problem 7, he noticed a subtle trick in the wording, a misdirection, but he corrected for it and moved on. 25 minutes later, he set his pencil down quietly, watching as others scribbled desperately. Calloway walked the aisles collecting the exams. When he reached Jalen, he paused. Their eyes met for a split second. Then Calloway moved on without a word. After class, the students filed out slowly, some chatting, others anxious about how they'd done. Jalen packed up without hurry. He liked to let the crowd thin out first, but as he stood to leave, something made him pause. He turned slightly and saw Calloway at his desk, flipping through the diagnostic exams. The professor had a red pen in his hand. As he reached Jalen's paper, he didn't just skim, he read each problem. Then again, then slowly capped the pen and drew a single red line under Jalen's name. Jalen frowned. No other paper had been marked. He didn't say anything, just walked out the door, the sound of the red pen's cap clicking still echoing in his ears. What did that red line mean? He didn't know yet, but he was about to find out. The professor marks Jalen's name with a red pen, after class. But why? The faculty lounge smelled of burnt coffee and overconfidence. The walls were lined with framed photos of former deans and Nobel Prize winners, all mostly white, all mostly male, the kind of faces that never left the room, even after they retired. On a worn leather couch near the coffee pot, Professor Richard Calloway sat with a manila folder in his lap, flipping slowly through a pile of diagnostic exams. Dr. Lindsay Rudin, a younger adjunct in the computer science department, walked in humming a low tune and pouring herself coffee. She nodded at Calloway. "Morning, Richard," she said, glancing at the papers. "You already started sorting through the wreckage?" Calloway didn't look up. Most of them flunked question 9. As expected. But one of them didn't, she said, walking over to peer at the top paper in his lap. Jalen Moore. That's the name everyone's been buzzing about. Black kid. First year. Supposedly nailed the whole thing. Calloway's pen stilled. He turned the paper over slowly, pressing it under his palm. Buzzing? Lindsay chuckled. Yeah, Sean in admissions told me he scored off the charts during placement. Didn't even need to take Calc 2 but did anyway. Something about wanting to build better mental habits. Smart and humble. That's rare. Calloway gave a non-committal grunt, the kind that sounded like agreement but wasn't. Lindsay didn't notice. I heard he's from Charlotte. Public school. No prep programs. Yet here he is, already making the rest of us look bad. Calloway smiled, but not with his eyes. How inspiring. He stood and walked to the sink, rinsing out his empty mug with precision. His fingers trembled slightly, only noticeable if someone were looking closely. But no one was. Lindsay sipped her coffee and turned toward the window. You know what I love about students like that? They remind you the system isn't rigged all the way. Like sometimes raw talent just kicks the door down. Calloway's voice was quiet, too quiet. Or sometimes the system bends over backwards to give them a door. Lindsay blinked. Excuse me? He turned to her with a polite smile. Nothing. Just that we tend to get a little too enthusiastic when someone defies expectations, don't we? Low bar and all. She stiffened, placing her mug down with a gentle clink. That's a dangerous line of thinking, Richard. He didn't respond. He just returned to the couch, flipping open another exam. But his thoughts weren't on integrals or vectors. They were on that red line under Jalen Moore's name. Calloway prided himself on identifying patterns. It was what made him a legend in theoretical mathematics. Numbers didn't lie. People did. And patterns, especially social ones, usually hid the truth behind performance. He had seen it before. Students who aced the first test but couldn't sustain it, burned out by pressure, or worse, revealed by their own ambition. What troubled him wasn't that Jalen had done well. It was how well. Clean margins. Elegant solutions. No scratch-outs. His work looked eerily familiar. Too familiar. He pulled Jalen's paper back out, scrutinizing the 5th problem again. It was solved using a shortcut technique that wasn't in the standard curriculum. In fact, it was something Calloway himself had published a paper on 8 years ago. A niche method only graduate students or deep-dive autodidacts would know. How did he know it? A soft knock on the lounge door interrupted his train of thought. Professor Henry Colburn, an old friend and colleague in the physics department, poked his head in. Richard, faculty review is in 10. You coming? Be right there. As Henry left, Calloway gathered his papers, but his mind stayed tethered to that question. He'd taught at this university for 23 years. He had mentored, challenged, even crushed dozens of promising minds. He believed in rigor, standards, earned success. But every now and then, someone would come along who threatened the fragile order of things, not by being loud or defiant, but by simply being undeniable. And Jalen Moore was threatening to be undeniable. It made something in his chest twist. Not fear, not yet, but something close to it. Later that day, in his office, Calloway sat in front of his computer reviewing old lecture recordings and grading rubrics. On a whim, he searched for Jalen's name in the university's academic history. The results were sparse but impressive. Jalen had taken summer courses at a local community college during high school, testing out of lower-level math. No record of misconduct. No history of accommodations. Just high marks and stellar recommendations. Calloway leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the armrest. Then he clicked open a new document and began typing. A custom quiz. Not from the textbook. Not from his usual archives. But from a dusty corner of his own unpublished research, proofs and curveballs that had stumped graduate students. Problems whose solutions required more than knowledge. They required intuition. He titled the document, Assessment, J. Moore, Confidential. Then he printed a single copy. It was time to see whether this young man's brilliance was authentic, or just a lucky spark catching wind. As he folded the paper and placed it into a drawer marked Special Review, the late afternoon sun caught the corner of a framed photo on his desk. It was him, 10 years ago, receiving the National Mathematics Excellence Award. A younger version of himself, full of certainty, ambition, and a belief in meritocracy. That man wouldn't have felt the chill of doubt he felt now. And perhaps that was what bothered him most. Calloway decides he'll test Jalen. His way. The classroom felt colder that morning, not in temperature, but in tone. Jalen noticed it the moment he stepped in. Students weren't talking as much. A few nodded politely at him, but the energy was off. He sat in the same back row seat, methodically pulling out his notebook, calculator and pencils like he always did. But there was something under his skin now, a faint static of anxiety he couldn't place. Professor Calloway walked in exactly on time, as usual. No greetings, no wasted breath, just authority and routine. Pop quiz, he said simply, and a collective groan rippled through the lecture hall. Calloway held up a neat stack of papers, unannounced, timed, 25 minutes, no notes, no calculators. He began distributing them, row by row, pausing briefly, when he reached Jalen. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat. "This one's yours," Calloway said, placing the test face down in front of him. Jalen nodded quietly. He didn't think much of the interaction until he flipped the paper over. 12 problems. But they looked strange. The wording was unusually dense, almost deliberately convoluted. A few of the questions referenced techniques he'd never encountered, even in advanced prep books. Others appeared mathematically broken. Undefined integrals with missing bounds. Contradictory variable definitions. He blinked, adjusted his glasses, and double-checked. No, it wasn't him. Something was off. But there was no time to overthink. He glanced at the clock. 24 minutes. He began scribbling down solutions as best he could, carefully working around the errors, fixing what he could, annotating what didn't make sense. He didn't want to leave blank spaces. That was never his style. Even when confused, he filled the page with logic, assumptions, and process. It wasn't about perfection. It was about showing the work. By the time Calloway called time, Jalen's hands were cramped, his brow damp with tension. He handed in his paper with a sinking feeling in his chest. He wasn't the only one. As the rest of the class trickled out, Jalen overheard two students whispering in the front row. "That quiz was hell." "Yeah, but question 6? That wasn't even solvable." He paused mid-step. "Wait, question 6? On his quiz, question 6 had been about improper integrals with conflicting limits. But this student seemed to be referencing a different problem entirely. Later that afternoon, Jalen sat outside the campus library, under the fading September sun. He pulled out his textbook and flipped through the relevant chapters, then reached into his bag and retrieved his returned quiz. A red D sat at the top corner, circled, underlined. But it wasn't just the grade that caught his eye. It was the ink. The comments. Each line of feedback was written in the same red pen Calloway had used when marking Jalen's name on the diagnostic exam. The critiques were brutal. Inadequate reasoning, poor grasp of core concepts, shows signs of academic guessing. But none of them addressed the structural flaws in the questions themselves. He opened the textbook beside the test and scanned through the corresponding sections. Page 20. Surface integrals. The textbook problem. Evaluate the integral over the given surface S, Z, X, cart. Jalen's quiz version. Evaluate the integral over surface S, where S is described by Z, X taro, Y taro with missing bounds, and a discontinuity at Y, Y boro. That wasn't a challenge. It was a trap. And suddenly, things clicked. The errors weren't accidental. They were curated. Someone Calloway had given him a rigged version of the quiz. And only him. His pulse quickened. His fingers clenched around the paper as a wave of quiet fury surged up his chest. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, coiled kind. The kind that made a person calculate. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't an oversight. It was surgical. He remembered Calloway's eyes that morning. Calm. Too calm. Like someone watching a machine run exactly as they'd designed it. Jalen looked back down at the red D again, and thought about every hallway warning he'd brushed off. Every upperclassman's subtle nod when Calloway's name came up in conversation. He hadn't wanted to believe it. He thought maybe those stories were exaggerations, ghosts from a more overtly racist past. But now he was holding evidence in his hand. Still, part of him doubted. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe it was coincidence. A mistake. But then he remembered what the student up front said. Question 6? That wasn't even solvable. Their question 6 was different. That was the proof. He opened his notebook and began transcribing every question from the quiz into a separate sheet, side by side with the textbook versions. Then he highlighted inconsistencies, errors, missing bounds. He noted which methods were referenced, which definitions contradicted standard theory. It wasn't just flawed, it was deliberately designed to confuse. If Calloway had done this to him, how many others had he done it to? How many brilliant students had been silently broken, worn down not by the difficulty of the material, but by sabotage? Jalen looked around the campus lawn, suddenly seeing the university with new eyes. The polished brick, the diversity posters, the empty slogans about equity and access. They felt like window dressing now. He tucked the quiz back into his folder and zipped his bag shut. Something had shifted inside him. Something hard and immovable. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. He stood, walked toward the library's glass doors, and didn't look back. Jalen pulls out the test and quietly compares it to the textbook. Something doesn't add up. The hallway outside Professor Calloway's office felt like walking into a courtroom. Fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead. The carpet was worn and colorless, muffling every footstep like a hush across a jury box. On the wall, a framed departmental honor roll showcased names and faces of past students, none of whom looked like Jalen. He stood outside Calloway's door for a moment, gathering himself. In his backpack was a manila folder, containing both the flawed quiz and the photocopies he had made from the textbook. Notes were carefully highlighted, inconsistencies tabbed, errors annotated with calm precision. But even with all that evidence, Jalen's heart thudded against his ribs like a warning. He knocked. "Come in." Calloway didn't look up when the door opened. He was seated behind his wide mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of papers. A framed photo of him with a former university president sat at the edge, their hands clasped in some long-forgotten award ceremony.
Yes?
Jalen stepped in and closed the door behind him. "Professor Calloway, I had a question about the quiz from Monday." Calloway finally looked up. His face was unreadable, lips pressed in a thin, professional smile. "Ah, Mr. Moore, you are the one who didn't quite meet expectations." Jalen's spine stiffened at the phrasing, but he sat down calmly across the desk. "I reviewed my quiz after class," he said. "There were several problems with the questions, errors, inconsistencies, even missing bounds. I compared it to the textbook, and it doesn't match the standard format or structure." Calloway's expression didn't change. "I see." He folded his hands and leaned back slightly. "Well, Mr. Moore, university-level math isn't always as tidy as a textbook. Sometimes real problems are messy. That's part of the challenge." Jalen opened the folder and slid the papers across the desk. "These aren't messy. They're broken. Question 4 uses undefined terms. Question 7 reverses axis direction, without context. And problem 10? It's from an unpublished research paper. Your paper." A flicker of tension passed through Calloway's jaw, but only for a second. "Are you suggesting," he said quietly, "that I deliberately gave you a different version of the quiz?" Jalen met his gaze. "Yes." A heavy silence blanketed the office. Calloway exhaled slowly, as if tired. "I've seen this before," he said, voice calm. "Gifted students. From underfunded schools. They come here with big expectations, and the moment they hit resistance, they assume sabotage. That's not what this is, isn't it?" Jalen clenched his hands in his lap to keep them from shaking. "I'm not asking for a retake. I'm asking for accountability." Calloway leaned forward now, elbows on the desk. His tone dipped, subtle, quiet, but sharp enough to slice. "Let me offer you some advice, Jalen. Success here isn't just about being smart. It's about being smart in the right way. Challenging your professors, especially ones who hold your future in their hands, isn't the kind of intelligence that survives long in academia." Jalen stared at him. "And if someone does survive it?" he asked. Calloway smiled, almost pitying. "Then maybe they didn't get here on merit in the first place." The words landed like ice water. It was the first time the mask slipped. Just a little. Just enough. In that moment, Jalen realized something bone deep. Calloway didn't care whether the quiz was fair. He cared that Jalen had dared to question him. That Jalen, a black freshman from a public high school, had scored higher on the diagnostic than most of his privileged classmates, and then had the nerve to say something when the game got rigged. This wasn't about calculus. It was about control. Jalen slowly reached into his jacket pocket and tapped his phone. Still recording. He stood. "Thank you for your time, Professor." Calloway tilted his head. "I hope this won't affect your confidence too much. Maybe you're just not quite ready for this level." Jalen paused with his hand on the door. "No, sir," he said without turning around. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Outside, he walked briskly across the quad, past rustling trees and the tall library dome that always reminded him of a watchtower. He pulled out his phone and stopped the recording, labeling it Calloway Office Quiz Confrontation. He considered his options. The academic review board? Too slow. Too internal. The dean? Possibly complicit. The student conduct office? He'd heard stories about buried complaints. He needed someone who wasn't afraid of ruffling feathers. Someone who didn't rely on tenure or titles to validate truth. He opened his email app and typed in a name. Dr. Claire Benton. Assistant chair of the sociology department. Not math. Not physics. But she'd published work on racial gatekeeping in STEM academia. Jalen had seen her speak during orientation. Her talk was fiery, unflinching. "Power doesn't yield because it's wrong," she'd said. "It yields because someone forces it to account for itself." He attached the recording along with the scanned versions of both the rigged quiz and the original textbook pages. Then he wrote, "Subject: Academic misconduct. Need urgent eyes. Dear Dr. Benton, I'm reaching out with a serious concern involving racial bias and academic misconduct in the mathematics department. Please listen to the attached recording. I've included supporting documents. I don't know who else will believe me. Thank you for your time. Jalen Moore." He hit send. The message disappeared into the ether, and somewhere in the bowels of the campus server, it began to move. Jalen records the entire conversation, then emails it to someone unexpected. It started with a knock. Not the loud, aggressive kind, but soft, deliberate, like the person on the other side of the dorm door already knew Jalen was inside. Already knew he wasn't expecting visitors. Already knew he'd be sitting at his desk, replaying the conversation with Professor Calloway over and over in his head. Jalen glanced at the door, hesitated, then got up and opened it. A tall student stood in the hallway. Sophomore, maybe. Slim, dark brown skin, hoodie pulled low, eyes alert. "You Jalen Moore?" he asked. Jalen nodded slowly. The student looked down the hallway, then back. "Come with me. We've been waiting." Jalen blinked. "For what?" "For you to realize the system isn't broken. It's working exactly how they built it." They walked in silence through the maze of red brick buildings, cutting between alleys and back entrances, until they reached the basement of the humanities building. The hallway lights buzzed faintly. At the end there was a door marked storage, but the student pulled out a key card and swiped it. The door opened into a small room, lined with mismatched chairs, and low shelves stacked with manila folders. A whiteboard sat in the corner, scribbled with meeting notes, campus event posters, and a timeline Jalen couldn't yet decipher. Inside were 6 students, 4 black, 1 Afro-Latina, and 1 South Asian, seated in a quiet semicircle. They turned when Jalen walked in, and for the first time in days, he didn't feel like he had to prove his presence. The tall student gestured toward a seat. "This is him, the one who emailed Benton." Jalen frowned. "How do you know about that?" "We don't work for her," said a girl with thick curls and gold-rimmed glasses. "But she forwards threats when they're real." "And yours?" "That was real." Jalen sat, backpack still on his shoulders, his heart beat loud in his ears. "Who are you?" he asked. "We're the Black Excellence Society," the girl said. "Officially we're an affinity group. Unofficially, we're the firewall." "Firewall?" She leaned forward. "The barrier between students like you and predators like Calloway." There was a beat of silence. Then another voice, calm, deeper, spoke up from the corner. A senior, older, his face sharp with focus. "Calloway's done this before. Twice that we can confirm. Both black students. Both top of their class." "Why didn't anyone say anything?" "They did," the girl said. "But Calloway's smart. He doesn't leave trails. No written proof. No official grades altered. Just patterns. custom quizzes, academic warnings, selective mentorship withdrawals. He makes them feel like they failed. Jalen slowly reached into his backpack and pulled out the folder. I kept my quiz, annotated it, compared it to the textbook. The older student took the folder and flipped through it carefully. His eyebrows lifted slightly. This is tight, he said. Clean logic. Good sourcing. They'll hate this. Jalen felt a flicker of something dangerous rise in his chest. Not anger, momentum. What happened to the others? He asked. The tall student leaned back against the wall. One transferred. Went to NYU. The other? Dropped out mid-semester. Stopped answering texts. Deleted everything. We tried to reach out too late. A silence settled in the room, heavy and familiar. Jalen looked around. So what happens now? The girl with glasses stood and walked to the whiteboard, erasing a few notes and scribbling a new name. More. We gather everything. Records, syllabi, any communication. You weren't the only one in the class. Someone else probably noticed the quiz differences. The older student added, we'll need corroboration. Audio if possible. Witnesses. The goal isn't just to catch him. It's to make it impossible for the university to ignore. Jalen nodded slowly. I have a recording from his office. It's subtle, but there's enough. The group exchanged looks. The tall student grinned for the first time. Then you've just leveled the playing field. Jalen didn't smile back, because he knew deep down, this wasn't about leveling. It was about surviving. That night, Jalen sat in the library long after it closed, tucked into a far corner by the windows. He couldn't study, couldn't focus. His mind kept circling one question. Why him? Was it his score? His skin? His silence? Had Calloway seen something threatening in the quiet confidence Jalen carried? Or had he simply decided, arbitrarily, that one more black success story was one too many? He scrolled through his phone, opening his email. No reply from Dr. Benton, no formal notice from the university. But one new message caught his eye. Subject confidential. Read immediately. From Anon. Weathered at protonmail. I knew Calloway back in 9. You're not crazy. I've been watching this university for years. Attached is a file. Use it wisely. A former ghost. Jalen's chest tightened. He opened the attachment. Inside was a scanned document. An old academic report. Dated 1997. The name at the top, Marcus Tillman. Student ID blurred. The course Advanced Mathematical Theory. The instructor Richard Calloway. Scrawled in the margins were handwritten notes, circled equations, and underlined feedback nearly identical to the ones Jalen had received. Phrases like academic guessing, poor grasp, and not yet ready for this level. It was almost word for word. The second page was a typed withdrawal notice. Reason: academic incompatibility. And beneath that, a short handwritten note from the department chair at the time. If there are patterns here, we need to review them. No student should feel targeted. It was unsigned. Jalen stared at the screen, heart pounding. Marcus Tillman had been the first. He hadn't imagined any of it. He wasn't alone. An ex-student from 1997 steps forward with a file and a warning. The university's silence was louder than any denial. Days passed. No emails, no inquiries, no calls from the dean's office. The recording, the annotated quiz, the anonymous tip, they had all been submitted, documented, organized, yet nothing moved. It was like throwing truth into a void and waiting for an echo that never came. But the Black Excellence Society didn't stop. In the back room of the humanities basement, under flickering fluorescent lights, Jalen sat at a folding table covered in laptops and paper stacks, next to Jordan, the tall sophomore who had first brought him into the group. Across the table, Simone, the girl with gold-rimmed glasses, scrolled through an internal faculty report the group had obtained through a Freedom of Information Act, FOIA request filed months ago. It had taken weeks to process, but the results had finally come in. This is it, she said, tapping her screen. It's not explicit, but the pattern's there. She turned the laptop toward Jalen. A spreadsheet, hundreds of rows, anonymized student IDs, course names, final grades. The file was color-coded, and Simone had already filtered it for Calloway's courses. Look, she said, when you compare students with matching GPAs and SAT math scores, the white students averaged nearly a full letter grade higher by the end of Calloway's courses. Jalen scanned the data. Columns of numbers blurred slightly from fatigue, but the discrepancy was clear. In dozens of instances, Black students entered Calloway's classes with equal or higher academic indicators, but left with significantly lower final grades. This is years of bias, Simone whispered. Jordan added, it's subtle, but systemic. The same kind of pattern you exposed with the quiz. Now it's scale. Jalen nodded, absorbing it all. But where's the most recent data? He asked. There's nothing from the last 5 years. Simone frowned and typed in another filter. She clicked and clicked again, then paused. That's weird. The table went blank. A red banner popped up. File not found. Records 2008. Jalen's chest tightened. You're telling me the last 5 years just disappeared? Jordan leaned in. No way. That's accidental. They purged it, Simone said. That's the only explanation. Someone knew what we were looking for. A silence fell over the room. Jalen sat back, his mind racing. So they're scrubbing it now? Or they already did? He stood abruptly. There has to be a backup. Jordan raised an eyebrow. Where would you even find that? Jalen didn't answer. His mind had already jumped ahead to a conversation weeks ago in passing with the department's administrative assistant, Mrs. Carrie Weston. She was close to retirement, quiet, kept to herself. But Jalen remembered her mentioning how she backed up all records manually, just in case the server monkeys mess it up again. She joked about how no one respected paper anymore. He grabbed his backpack. I'm going to the math building. The hallways were empty when Jalen arrived. It was late, well past office hours. The old building echoed with the weight of its own silence. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, where a small row of administrative offices faced the atrium. Carrie Weston's desk was behind a sliding glass window. Closed now, the blinds half drawn. But through the slats he could see her cluttered workstation. Framed photos of grandchildren, sticky notes, a rubber band ball the size of a grapefruit, and a drawer half open, with a tangle of USB flash drives inside. Jalen's heart thudded. He hesitated. This wasn't how he operated. No lines crossed, no shortcuts taken. But this wasn't just about him anymore. Calloway's pattern went beyond academic sabotage. It was structural, it was historical, and it was protected. He tried the office door. Locked. But the mail slot at the bottom of the door was wide enough to reach through. He knelt down, slipped his arm in, and stretched fingers grazing the drawer's handle. Nothing. He shifted his weight, flattened his chest to the carpet, and reached again. Clink. He caught the edge of one of the drives between his fingers and pulled it forward, inch by inch, until it slipped into his palm. He stood up, brushing dust off his shirt. The hallway remained still. He left quickly, heart pounding, and made his way back to the basement room. Back at the society's hideout, Jordan plugged the flash drive into an encrypted laptop and opened the root folder. It was there. Gradebook Backup 2008. Simone gasped softly. Jalen leaned over, and they watched as the spreadsheet loaded. Line after line of color-coded data. The same formatting as the FOIA report, but this time current. Jalen filtered by Calloway's name. The screen filled with student records, some flagged in yellow, some in red. And then they saw it, a hidden column, marked with a double asterisk. Jordan clicked to expand it. The header read, Manual Grade Adjustment, Rationale Notes, Private. Inside the cells were short comments. Student shows overconfidence, may need correction. Performance inconsistent with background, likely overplaced. Lack of professional demeanor, adjusted accordingly. Seems to be coasting, applied pressure. Simone whispered, he wrote this. These are his thoughts. Jalen felt his stomach twist. These weren't academic notes. They were judgments. Biased, coded, drenched in prejudice. No rubrics, no formal justifications. Just private remarks that led directly to lowered grades. He scrolled down until he found his own name. There it was. More, Jalen. Diagnostic. Quiz 1. Manual adjustment. Note, performance contradicts placement. Watch for inconsistency. A silence heavier than before settled in the room. Jalen didn't look away. He had his proof now, and the university had something to answer for. Jalen finds a backup on a discarded flash drive from the department secretary's drawer. The numbers didn't just speak to Jalen. They whispered in poetry. After uncovering the secret grading notes, after the realization that his academic trajectory had been manually manipulated, Jalen returned to what had always grounded him. The beauty of the equation. The silence of symmetry. The incorruptibility of logic. If Calloway wanted to question his placement, his worth, his presence, Jalen would answer in the only language that couldn't be twisted: math. For 2 weeks he barely left his room, his whiteboard filled corner to corner with symbols and proofs. He skipped meals, turned off his phone, the Black Excellence Society covered for him when professors asked questions. Even Simone kept her distance, respecting the rhythm of obsession. He was working on a generalization of Stokes's theorem, reimagining its structure for non-orientable manifolds, something most undergraduates wouldn't dare touch. But Jalen wasn't trying to prove he was brilliant. He was proving that no one could erase brilliance even if they tried. And then, it happened. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, with his fingers cramped and his mind frayed, he stood back from his desk, staring at a completed 6-page derivation. It was seamless, clean. Every line followed. Every transformation justified. He didn't just solve something, he revealed something new. A quiet knock broke his trance. It was Jordan, holding 2 coffees and a manila envelope. "You breathing?" he asked, stepping in.
Barely.
Jordan handed him a coffee. "I ran your latest work by Professor Lenner. You know, the visiting guy from MIT. Jalen looked up sharply. "Why would you do that?" "Because you're not just fighting Calloway anymore," Jordan said. "You're redefining the battlefield." He handed Jalen the envelope. Inside was a formal letter on university letterhead. Departmental Seminar. Invitation. "We are pleased to invite Jalen A. Moore to present his recent work on generalizing Stokes' theorem to the Advanced Mathematics Seminar, to be held Friday at 3:00 p.m. in the Hartley Lecture Hall. Special guests will include Dr. Alan Lenner, MIT, Dr. Karen Dupree, Stanford, and select faculty. We look forward to your presentation." Jalen's hands trembled slightly as he read it twice, then 3 times. He looked at Jordan. "They want me to present?" "You're not a footnote anymore," Jordan said. "You're the headline." The day of the seminar, the lecture hall buzzed with an energy rarely reserved for undergraduates. Students filed in. Curious. Professors murmured among themselves, wondering who this freshman was who'd earned attention from Ivy League eyes. Jalen stood near the side door, dressed sharply in a dark blazer and pressed slacks. He held his proof in a black binder, thumb rubbing the corner with a quiet rhythm. From across the room, he saw Professor Calloway step in. The crowd seemed to part for him. He moved with his usual calm detachment, nodding to colleagues, pretending not to notice the curiosity swirling around him. Jalen's pulse quickened. But then came the announcement. "Before we begin," said Dr. Dupree at the podium, "Professor Calloway has generously offered to introduce today's speaker." Jalen's stomach dropped. He hadn't been told that. Calloway stepped to the front with practiced ease. He adjusted the microphone and scanned the room. "Today we have the rare privilege of hearing from a young mind who has apparently discovered something the rest of us missed." The audience chuckled lightly. Calloway smiled. "Jalen Moore is a freshman." "Yes, freshman, and yet he has been invited to present in a forum typically reserved for postdocs and faculty. That alone is impressive." A pause. "And yet, we must remember that even the brightest sparks can sometimes burn too quickly." Silence. Calloway continued. "Mathematics is not merely about arriving at an answer. It's about discipline, rigor, respect for process. I look forward to seeing whether Mr. Moore's work holds up to the standards this department demands." He stepped back, nodding toward Jalen. A few professors exchanged glances. The subtext wasn't lost on them. Jalen walked to the podium, chest tight. He looked out at the room. At Calloway, who sat dead center now. At Dr. Lenner and Dr. Dupree, watching intently. At the students waiting for him to fail or fly. He took a breath. Then he began. "Mathematics," Jalen said, voice clear, "doesn't care who you are, where you're from, or what someone wrote in a private grading note." There was a stir. He flipped to the first slide, a clean rendering of his proof. "What I'm about to present isn't just a derivation. It's a refusal to be dismissed, a refusal to accept that brilliance must wear a certain skin, or speak with a certain pedigree." Each line of his proof flowed like poetry. Elegant, logical, unassailable. Gasps rippled at moments. Heads nodded. Even Calloway's posture stiffened, as the realization dawned. Jalen wasn't just performing, he was teaching. When he concluded, the room was silent for a beat. Then came the applause. Slow, then faster, louder, standing. Dr. Lenner rose first. "That," he said, "was the cleanest undergraduate presentation I've seen in a decade." Calloway didn't clap. He sat, arms crossed, face unreadable. But inside, something was unraveling. Later that night, as the sun dipped behind the ivy-covered walls, Jalen received an email from the Dean of Mathematics.
Subject: let's meet.
Jalen, I'd like to meet privately about your research and recent concerns regarding Professor Calloway. I believe it's time we had a larger conversation. Dean Abigail wrote. But just as Jalen read it, another email pinged into his inbox. From Calloway. Subject: thoughtful work. Impressive performance today. I'd be happy to write you a recommendation letter for your next step, should you decide to take a different academic path. Jalen stared at the message. Take a different path? It was a threat wrapped in civility. And then Jordan texted. You won't believe what we just found. Check your email. Attached was a forwarded internal memo. Calloway had petitioned the seminar board last week, before Jalen even got the invitation, volunteering to introduce the speaker as a mentor figure. He had planned it all. The smile, the praise, the subtle sabotage. But something in the metadata of the email didn't sit right. Simone decoded it in seconds. Calloway had tried to upload a corrupted version of Jalen's slides into the seminar system, days before the event. It failed to overwrite because the server had already locked file access. He hadn't just wanted to cast doubt. He'd tried to sabotage the proof itself. Calloway volunteers to introduce Jalen's talk, but his plan is darker than anyone expects. The seminar room had never felt more alive or more fragile. It was 2 days after Jalen's explosive presentation, and a second follow-up session had been organized to allow department faculty and select students to ask deeper technical questions about his proof. The room was packed once again, not just out of academic interest but because word had spread a freshman had outclassed his tenured gatekeeper, and people wanted to witness whatever came next. Jalen arrived early, laptop in hand, his revised slides loaded, and double-backed on both a USB drive and an encrypted cloud link. He wasn't taking any chances. Jordan stood off to the side, helping test the audio setup. Simone was near the exit, watching everything like a hawk. Dr. Lenner and Dr. Dupree had returned, sitting near the front with a stack of questions and notes. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Some were supporters, others skeptics, but all eyes were waiting for one thing: whether Jalen could do it again under pressure. And sitting in the third row, as smug and silent as ever, was Professor Calloway. Jalen could feel his presence like static. The man radiated control, not just over the students he taught, but over the very air around him. No gestures, no expressions, just the kind of stillness that made people doubt themselves. As the moderator approached the podium to begin, Jalen took a deep breath. He checked his laptop one last time. Everything looked normal. All slides rendered. No visual glitches. Whenever you're ready, the moderator said. Jalen walked to the front and plugged in the projector cable. For a moment, the screen stayed black. Then the university logo appeared. Then, static. The projector flickered. The slides popped up, but scrambled. Mathematical symbols replaced by black boxes. Equations broken. Characters warped. Animations frozen mid-transition. The audience murmured. Jalen's stomach dropped. He unplugged and replugged the cable. Nothing. He tried switching inputs. Still scrambled. The room began shifting. People glancing at each other, whispering. Confusion turned quickly to suspicion. Calloway raised his hand, his voice loud and casual. Technical glitches happen, especially with complex files. The word complex hung in the air like a jab. Jalen forced a smile. Let me try another copy. He switched to his backup USB, but the same thing happened. Identical corruption. Even the fine lines had altered. Extra characters appended to the end of each slide. It didn't make sense. Unless, he looked at Jordan, whose eyes narrowed instantly. I'm going to check the AV booth, Jordan said. Already moving. The AV booth was tucked into the back of the room, hidden behind tinted glass, and accessed through a locked side hallway. Jordan had a contact there. Malik, a sophomore computer science major, who worked part-time managing seminar tech. Malik let him in and frowned immediately. What's going on? Jalen's presentation just glitched in front of the whole room. Both copies corrupted. That's impossible, Malik said, typing quickly. I ran a test load last night. It worked perfectly. Check access logs, Jordan said. Malik blinked. Why? Because someone knew he'd use this room again. He opened the log files, scrolling through time-stamped entries. Okay, here's yesterday. Lenner's talk. No issues. Late-night server patch. All normal. Then his eyes stopped on a line. Remote access Kriginet Arse Calloway. Jordan leaned in. That's not normal. Nope. Malik clicked deeper. The log showed a remote login at 2:11 a.m. that morning. From a campus IP address, the file path matched Jalen's presentation folder. And then Malik saw something else. A command string, run batch scramble.cockwache, silent. His jaw clenched. That's not a system function. That's a custom corruption script, masked to look like a Microsoft error. Jordan felt his pulse rise. Can you screenshot this? Malik hesitated.
This is bad, he said. If I report this, and I'm wrong, I lose my job, my scholarship.
You're not wrong. Yeah, but this is Callaway. The booth fell silent. Back in the seminar room, Jalen was trying to recover. He turned the malfunction into a chalkboard session, drawing key equations manually, breaking down each line. His voice was steady, but his confidence wavered with each dry erase squeak. The audience had thinned. Some bored, others skeptical. The magic of his original presentation, undone by a cloud of doubt and technical failure. And Callaway watched with quiet satisfaction. Malik bit his lip. I need 10 minutes, he said. Let me clean the log data. If I forward it raw, they'll trace it back to me instantly. Jordan nodded. You're saving someone's future right now. Malik didn't respond. He was already typing. Downstairs, Jalen wrapped up the session. He'd salvaged what he could, demonstrated enough to hold attention, but not enough to impress the way he had the first time. When he walked out, he didn't stop in the hallway. He went straight to the stairwell, fists clenched, heart pounding. Not from failure, but from knowing someone had tried to manufacture it. Simone followed, her voice low. It wasn't you. They saw through it. But some didn't, Jalen said, and Callaway saw enough to keep smiling. He sat on the bottom stair, running a hand down his face. Then Jordan came down, holding out a flash drive. It's real, he said. He did it. We've got the script logs, credentials, timestamps, all tied to his university login. Jalen stared at it. This is everything. Not everything, Malik's voice echoed behind them. He had followed Jordan down. I can get fired for what I just did. If Callaway finds out I gave you this, I lose tuition coverage. I lose housing. Jalen stood slowly. I'll protect you. I promise. Malik looked at him. I want to believe that. But the system doesn't reward truth. It punishes the people who speak it. Jalen nodded slowly, his eyes heavy. But sometimes, he said, the truth punishes back. The tech student hesitates. Exposing Callaway could cost him his scholarship. Dean Abigail Rowe had never been more tired of the truth. It came not in confessions, but in file attachments. Anonymous, encrypted, and damning. She sat alone in her office on the 4th floor of the mathematics building, the early evening light washing her desk in pale gold. Her computer screen glowed with a subject line she couldn't ignore. Urgent. Academic misconduct. Evidence enclosed. The email had no signature, just a Proton mail address, and 3 attached files. Audio.mp3. A quiet conversation between a student and Professor Callaway, calm on the surface, but laced with disdain. Grade data.sve. 2 decades of grading discrepancies, color-coded by race, and GPA. Scramble logs. .zip. Remote server logs, custom code strings, and screenshots. Technical, precise, inarguable. She opened them in silence, her breath tightening with each click. The audio chilled her. Callaway's voice, measured, professional, cloaked in a language of not ready, inconsistent performance, and corrective guidance. Not a single slur, not a raised voice. But it was all there. The tone, the power, the manipulation. The data file was worse. Years of patterns, black students underperforming only in his courses, identical prep scores, divergent outcomes, notes in private grading columns that read more like personal vendettas than pedagogy. And then the logs. She didn't fully understand the code, but she didn't need to. Her IT liaison, whom she had secretly forwarded it to under the guise of technical protocol verification, had responded within an hour. This is a targeted file corruption. The user credentials, our Callaway, match our central login logs. The script is masked to look like a Microsoft failure, but it was manually run. It had one purpose: sabotage. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Richard Callaway had been with the university for over 2 decades. Published. Revered. An institution within an institution. He had mentored 5 faculty hires, sat on the admissions advisory board, had alumni donors on speed dial. If this came out publicly, It wouldn't just stain Calloway. It would engulf the department, the college, her office. Abigail had spent 15 years climbing this system, first as a researcher, then department head, now dean. She knew how fragile institutional respect was, how easily one scandal could turn a legacy into a cautionary tale. And worse, she knew what came after. Lawsuits, articles, alumni backlash, cuts. So she did what she'd always been trained to do. She looked for context. She opened a new document and began taking notes, not on the evidence but on the optics. Pattern lacks direct causation chain.
Student's performance not conclusively altered. No grade appeal filed.
Motive of accuser unknown. Data could reflect unconscious bias, not malicious intent. The kind of language the university could stand behind. Ambiguous, defensible, deliberately gray. But when she reached for her pen, her hand stopped. Because part of her, buried deep under the weight of bureaucracy, was furious. She'd seen this before, not just with Calloway, but in smaller ways. Students of color disproportionately penalized for participation, labeled unengaged when they were quiet, unprofessional when they asked for transparency, aggressive when they demanded fairness. It was never explicit. That's what made it so indestructible. And now she had proof. Actual, undeniable, systemic evidence. She could choose to bury it, protect the institution, or she could burn a piece of it down. She stared at the screen for a long time, then picked up the phone. The meeting was scheduled quietly. No emails, no calendar invites, no student advocates, no legal observers. Just Dean Abigail Rowe and Professor Richard Calloway. He arrived 5 minutes early, as always. Charcoal blazer, pressed collar, unbothered. When he entered her office, he didn't sit immediately. You wanted to speak, Abigail? She gestured to the chair across from her. He lowered himself into it, like he belonged there more than she did. She let the silence sit for a beat too long. An anonymous submission came across my desk. She began. Audio, data, e-logs, regarding a student, Jalen Moore. Calloway nodded slightly, as if hearing a familiar song. Ah, yes. The young man with quite the flair for dramatics. She didn't smile. I've reviewed the materials. They're serious. They're also circumstantial, Calloway said smoothly. Audio recordings without context. Data pulled by students who lack full access to our grading rubrics. IT logs that could be misinterpreted. You logged into the AV system at 2:11 a.m. and ran a custom corruption script. A test, he replied calmly. I was stress testing student files to check for compatibility. Common practice. She leaned forward. Richard, you ran that script on the same file Moore was presenting from. The same file he loaded on a university projector. Less than 10 hours later, he folded his hand. Coincidences happen. You also manually adjusted his grade after marking his work with non-standard annotations. We have the flash drive backup. I review all borderline performance cases thoroughly. It's part of ensuring standards are upheld. And as you know, we're not required to preserve preliminary grades in perpetuity. Abigail exhaled slowly. She felt the old system in him. Its posture, its language, its smug protection. She had known men like him her entire career. Safe, insulated, so confident in their invincibility they no longer worried about hiding the blade, only polishing the handle. You understand what happens if this goes public? She asked. To him or to me? He replied. She paused, and that was when she knew. He wasn't worried. He was daring her. Push this and the university takes a hit. Back off, and everything stays clean. A long silence fell between them. Then, in a quiet voice that almost trembled from exhaustion, she said, We're scheduling a disciplinary review. Internal. Private. Calloway raised an eyebrow. With just you. He leaned back. Smart. No recordings. No transcripts. You'll respond to questions regarding your grading history, course design, and conduct with students. And if you don't convince the panel, he smiled faintly. You'll do what? Terminate me mid-semester? With what grounds? One student's grievance and a few speculative files? She looked at him, her eyes tired. We'll find the grounds. He sets up a private disciplinary meeting, with only Calloway present. The invitation came folded in an unmarked envelope, slipped under Jalen's dorm door like a secret. To Jalen A. Moore. Subject: Academic Integrity Review. Required attendance. Date: Friday 9. Location: Faculty Conference Room B. Confidential panel. No representatives permitted. It felt less like a meeting and more like a warning. No mention of who would be on the panel. No option to bring support. No mention of what specifically was being reviewed. Just a date, a time, and the cold language of institutional procedure. Jalen showed up in a pressed shirt and blazer, his evidence files organized in a slim black binder. Jordan had offered to come. Simone, too. Even Dr. Benton had hinted that she'd try to intervene. But the wording was clear. No representatives permitted. He stood outside the frosted glass doors for a long moment, breathing slow, steady. Every instinct screamed, "Don't go in alone." But he did. The conference room smelled like air conditioning, an old wood polish. 3 panelists sat at the far end of the long table, Dean Rowe at the center, flanked by 2 senior faculty members from departments that had nothing to do with math. Neutral faces. Blank stares. One scribbled notes in a leather-bound pad. The other sipped black coffee without making eye contact. Professor Calloway sat off to the side. Arms crossed, mouth unreadable. Posture relaxed like someone who'd sat in this exact room many times before. And always left untouched. Jalen took the empty seat across from them, setting his binder down carefully. Dean Rowe cleared her throat. "Mr. Moore, thank you for joining us. This is a confidential review panel regarding a potential breach of academic integrity related to your recent coursework and research presentations. We'd like to hear your account." He blinked. "You think I cheated?" "We are not making assumptions," Rowe replied evenly. "We are conducting a fact-finding session." Calloway spoke next, calmly. There were several red flags. First, the diagnostic exam, statistically anomalous. Then a quiz submission that contradicted in-class performance, followed by a highly advanced research proof. Unprecedented for a first year. Jalen stared at him. "You know I wrote that myself." Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps, but the originality of the work combined with your sudden academic improvement warrants scrutiny." "And the sabotaged seminar files?" Jalen said, his voice low. Rowe looked up. "We have not verified any technical misconduct. I have screenshots, server logs, a custom script tied to Calloway's credentials." "From an anonymous source," Calloway interrupted. "Easily fabricated." Jalen opened his binder and placed the printed logs on the table. "I brought everything. The emails, the audio, the gradebook files, the hidden column with his annotations." The faculty member with the leather pad flipped through the documents slowly. "These are serious accusations," he said, "but speculative unless verified through university channels." Jalen felt the heat rising in his throat. "You're not verifying them. You're burying them." Rowe's tone sharpened. "We are following due process." "No," Jalen replied. "You're staging a performance. You called me here to justify why I'm in this room instead of him." Calloway didn't flinch. Rowe's expression remained professional, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Not guilt. Strategy." "Jalen," she said quietly, "we need you to understand how this looks from the outside. A freshman leveling accusations against a tenured faculty member, without formal grievance channels, without departmental review, because you locked the doors to those channels." He opened the final page of his binder, the one with the screenshot from 1997, Marcus Tillman's file. The first known case. Calloway sat up straighter. Jalen placed it in the center of the table. "This isn't just about me. It's a pattern, and it's been happening long before I ever stepped on this campus." The room fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then in a voice as cold as winter rain, Calloway said, "You seem like a bright young man, but brilliance is no substitute for humility. Perhaps your real struggle isn't with injustice, but with ego." The word hit like a slap. Ego. As if challenging injustice was vanity. As if surviving sabotage was arrogance. Jalen's mouth went dry. He looked to Rowe. "So what happens now?" She folded her hands. "We will deliberate. You'll be notified within 10 business days. No transcript, no recording. Internal reviews are not public record." Jalen stood slowly, pushing his chair back with a dull scrape. "So I'm the one on trial." Rowe didn't respond. Calloway stood too, smoothing his blazer. "You'll understand someday," he said. "Not everything is about race. Sometimes failure just looks for someone else to blame." Jalen froze. The air turned electric. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a voice echoed from the hallway. Strong, sharp, familiar. "That's enough." The room turned. Dr. Claire Benton stood in the doorway, a folder in one hand, her ID badge clipped visibly to her jacket. Behind her were two administrators and a campus legal advisor. Rose's eyes narrowed. "This is a closed session." "Not anymore," Benton replied, stepping inside. She placed a new set of documents on the table. "We've just completed an expedited audit based on Jalen Moore's allegations, and I suggest we all read what was uncovered." Calloway's face lost its color. A surprise voice from the hallway interrupts the meeting. "That's enough. They didn't plan to go public."
Not at first.
The goal had always been internal accountability, to prove the sabotage, expose the bias, and force the university to handle it through proper channels. But after the mock trial, after watching Jalen sit across from Calloway while evidence was dismissed like rumor, something in the Black Excellence Society snapped. It was Simone who said it first. "They're not trying to solve this. They're trying to survive it." So that night, in their cramped basement room beneath the Humanities building, they launched the plan they'd only whispered about before. Jordan built the microsite. Malik sanitized the server logs. Simone curated the emails, removed names of students not involved, highlighted the most damning comments from the grading logs. They clipped the audio of Calloway's patronizing tone during office hours. They uploaded the raw footage from Jalen's first seminar, the flawless presentation before the glitch. Then, just before midnight, they wrote the headline, "Silence Genius: How a Tenured Professor Tried to Erase a Black Student's Brilliance," underneath a single call to action: justice for Jalen.
They hit publish.
And the world moved. It started slowly. A retweet from a local sociology professor. A repost by a TikTok page on racial bias in education. A screenshot shared by an anonymous faculty whistleblower account. If you knew how deep this goes. By sunrise, the hashtag had been picked up by a regional news station. By noon, it was on the homepage of Reddit. That afternoon it trended globally. Justice for Jalen became more than a phrase. It was a siren. College students across the country began posting their own stories. Black STEM majors, women in male-dominated programs, first-gen scholars, who had felt the sting of microaggressions wrapped in GPA drops and professionalism concerns. The story struck a nerve, and then came the big accounts. A Pulitzer-winning journalist tweeted the video. A former Ivy League professor shared the grading log with the caption, "This is why we lose black talent in STEM." The university issued a carefully worded statement.
"We are aware of the concerns raised regarding recent academic experiences. The university remains committed to equity, transparency, and institutional integrity. We are conducting a thorough review."
But the internet didn't wait for reviews. News trucks began circling the campus gates. Students marched outside the mathematics building, with signs that read,
Truth. Tenure.
"Math doesn't lie, but Callaway does. We are not your statistical outliers." Even professors began speaking up. Some quietly, some publicly. An open letter circulated with 23 faculty signatures demanding an external investigation. And through it all, Jalen stayed quiet. Not because he was hiding, but because he knew the storm didn't need his voice to grow. It had already taken on a life of its own. At 6:12 p.m., his mother called. He hadn't told her everything. She knew about the presentation, knew about Calloway's difficult reputation, but not the full scope, not the mock trial, not the sabotage. She hadn't needed to. The media had. Her voice was calm, but tinged with a wariness he recognized. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't want to worry you. I worry when you go quiet, baby." He didn't know what to say. There was a long pause. Then she added, "Someone called the house today. A woman. Said she was with a civil rights firm. From DC. Jalen sat up straighter. "Who?" "Lena Woods. She said her team specializes in educational discrimination and federal complaints. Asked if she could speak with you directly." Jalen wrote the name down slowly. His mother lowered her voice. "She said this isn't just about your grade. Said this is the kind of case that reaches the Department of Education. That it could set precedent." Jalen closed his eyes. He had never imagined this would go beyond the university, beyond the classroom, beyond Calloway. But maybe that's what made this moment so dangerous. This wasn't about his future anymore. It was about who else they'd tried to break before him, and who they'd try next. He took a breath. "Can you send me her number?" His mother paused. "Jalen?
Yeah?
No matter what happens, don't let them tell you you're lucky to be there. They're lucky to have you." That landed deeper than she could have known. That night, back in his dorm, Jalen stared out the window at the protest forming on the quad. Hundreds of students, flashlights raised like fireflies, chants rising into the night. He hadn't joined them, not yet. Instead, he sat at his desk, holding the card Jordan had printed earlier. Lena Woods, S. Woods, Langston and Wells, Civil Rights Litigation Division, D.C., L.A., Atlanta. On the back, Jordan had written one word in marker. Move. Jalen's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Jalen? A woman's voice. Confident. Controlled. This is Lena Woods. I've been briefed on your case, and I'm going to say something that may sound premature, but you need to hear it. He said nothing. You're not just fighting a professor, you're challenging a machine. One built over decades, designed to erase you without ever needing to say your name out loud. But here's the thing, it's glitching, and you are the glitch. Still, Jalen said nothing. She continued, I want to represent you. We'll go after the university, the department, and if necessary, we'll take it federal. But I need to know something first. What's that? Are you ready for this to get even bigger? Jalen looked down at the flash drive on his desk, then out at the crowd, and finally, at the unopened acceptance letter he had received 3 weeks ago, an invitation to join a national undergraduate research program at MIT. He picked up the letter and the card. He didn't answer right away, because it wasn't a simple yes. It was something heavier. He was no longer defending his name. He was demanding a reckoning. A lawyer contacts Jalen's mother with a powerful offer. The decision wasn't impulsive. It came slowly, one sleepless night, after another. One whispered conversation with Lena Woods, after the next. One more news story calling him the genius who got sabotaged while omitting every brutal detail of what it felt like to sit in front of power and be doubted. Again and again. 3 weeks after the story went viral, Jalen filed a federal lawsuit against the university. The charges were explicit: racial discrimination, academic retaliation, intentional emotional distress, sabotage of educational trajectory, suppression of whistleblower testimony. Filed in U.S. District Court with Lena Woods as lead counsel, and backed by Woods, Langston and Wells, a powerhouse in civil rights litigation. The lawsuit named both the university and Professor Richard Callaway individually. The day it hit the court registry, Lena stood beside Jalen during the press conference outside the marble steps of the courthouse. He wore the same blazer from his first seminar. She wore the armor of decades of courtroom war. Behind them stood a row of student allies, Black Excellence Society members, student government reps, even a few quiet professors who had decided enough was enough. The media swarmed. Jalen didn't flinch. My name is Jalen Moore, he said into the cluster of microphones, and I'm suing not because I failed, but because I wasn't allowed to succeed. Inside the courtroom, things were colder, less cinematic, more surgical. The university hired a high-powered law firm. Their lead attorney, a man named Gregory Stratton, was known for settlements, not surrender. He sat across from Lena during the preliminary hearing and smiled like someone who'd been through dozens of these kinds of cases before. This could be handled quietly, he offered. An internal review, a closed-door agreement, confidential mediation. Lena's smile never touched her eyes. You want quiet, she said, because noise exposes rot. They moved forward with discovery. That's when the rot began to surface. Through subpoenas, Lena's team accessed internal emails between senior faculty, some dated as far back as 2010, while most were sterile and bureaucratic. A few stood out like knives in a drawer. One from Callaway to a colleague. I'm concerned we're seeing an overcorrection in admissions. Some of these students are skipping steps, and it's showing. Another replying, it's diversity theater. Don't let them drag you for maintaining standards.
Then came the faculty meeting notes. Hidden away in an old shared drive, forgotten but recoverable, Callaway had pushed against curriculum dilution and empathy grading more aggressively than anyone on record.
The phrase merit-based rigor must remain untouched by equity pressure appeared 5 times in his proposals. But the biggest crack came during depositions. A former TA, nervous but resolute, testified under oath that Callaway had once referred to a group of students as statistical noise during a grading session. Another former staffer, who had since transferred to another university, recalled watching Callaway adjust quiz formats mid-semester for certain students after performance reviews. When pressed to name those students, she whispered, they were always the ones who didn't look like him. Outside the courtroom, the story caught fire again. Civil rights groups filed amicus briefs. The National Coalition for Equity in Higher Ed released a report titled Excellence Denied: The Moore Case and the Reproduction of Academic Gatekeeping. Talk shows debated whether this was an isolated incident or a symptom of something deeper. And through it all, Jalen showed up. Silent, sharp, and watching everything. The university, meanwhile, played defense. They released a second public statement, this time more aggressive. We deny all allegations of discrimination or sabotage. The university has a long-standing commitment to academic excellence and equity. We believe the legal process will affirm that commitment. But the cracks were spreading. A third-party audit commissioned under mounting pressure confirmed disparities in grade distribution across race and major in several STEM departments. Calloway wasn't the only one. He was just the boldest. Lena stood in court and called it a network of academic profiling masquerading as excellence. She paused for emphasis. And Jalen Moore was its latest victim. As jury selection began, the university tried one final tactic. They filed a motion to dismiss. Lack of sufficient evidence.
Subjective interpretation.
No confirmed causal link.
The judge denied the motion. This case warrants a full trial. Tension grew. Inside the court, Jalen sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap as the first witnesses took the stand. Outside, protesters returned. Hashtags resurfaced. Students wore shirts with a single equation across the chest. Brilliance Neil's whiteness. Then came the twist. No one saw coming. On the fourth day of trial, a juror, a black woman in her late 30s, quiet and composed, slipped a note to the court-martial during lunch break. It read, "I need to be excused. I've received a message that has compromised my ability to remain impartial." The judge called a closed chamber session. The message? A thinly veiled threat, sent anonymously, to her personal phone. Careful how you vote. Some professors build legacies bigger than one angry student. The courtroom froze. The judge demanded a digital forensic team trace the message, but the number was untraceable. Burner phone, masked IP. The juror was dismissed. The media caught wind within hours. Headlines blared. Juror in Moore case threatened. Trial rocked by intimidation claim. University sabotage case takes dark turn. Lena called it what it was. This isn't just academic sabotage anymore. It's obstruction of justice. The court recessed for the day. Jalen left through the back exit, eyes forward, mouth shut. But inside, something was burning. They hadn't just tried to silence him in a classroom. Now, they were trying to silence the law. A juror receives an anonymous threat and requests removal. The email arrived at 6:04 a.m., before the campus had fully stirred. Subject: administrative update. Prof. Richard Calloway. To faculty and staff. From Office of the Provost. Effective immediately, Professor Richard Calloway has been placed on administrative suspension pending the outcome of the ongoing investigation. During this period, he is relieved of all teaching, mentoring, and research duties. This action is not a declaration of guilt, but a precautionary measure in accordance with university policy. There was no ceremony, no press release, no words of gratitude for decades of service. Just an email. By mid-morning, students were already whispering about it in hallways and lecture halls. A screenshot of the email hit Reddit, then Instagram, then Twitter. The comment sections were a battlefield. Took long enough. Suspension isn't enough. He failed me in 2018 after I asked why I got a C on a paper with no comments. Never made sense until now.
This happened to me too. He said I lacked discipline. I was the only black woman in that class.
One by one, former students, some recent, some from decades ago, began to speak up. What started as murmurs became a flood. Posts emerged across social media with the tag Gan Calloway pattern, each containing variations of the same story, being singled out, subtly demeaned, held to shifting standards, then quietly failed. Some included screenshots of old assignments. Others referenced dismissed grievances. A few shared emails from academic advisors, telling them to choose their battles. One video from a 2016 graduate went viral in a matter of hours. She sat in her car speaking directly into the camera, her voice calm but heavy. "He told me in office hours that I wrote like someone trying to sound smarter than they are. I was a published writer at the time. That comment made me stop writing altogether, for 3 years. It hit 3.7 million views by sunset. In the administration building, behind thick oak doors, the damage control meetings began. The university's legal team scrambled to limit fallout. The PR department drafted a values statement that no one liked. The Board of Trustees held a closed-door session to discuss tenure vulnerabilities. But the one blow they hadn't anticipated came from within. An anonymous faculty whistleblower leaked an internal audit conducted by the department in 2019, never released publicly. The report, 47 pages long, detailed notable disparities in Callaway's grading metrics based on race and gender, spanning nearly 2 decades. It recommended peer observation, additional training, and most damningly, a full academic review of his course design and evaluation methods. But the audit had been shelved, quietly. The signatures at the bottom were blurred in the leak, but the implication was loud. They had known, and they had done nothing. The backlash turned radioactive. Local news ran segments titled, "Excellence or Exclusion: The Quiet Power of Academic Gatekeepers." National anchors followed suit. The university's name trended on social media, for all the wrong reasons. Enrollment inquiries from out-of-state students dropped by 19% in less than a week. Donors paused their funding. Alumni sent letters demanding an apology. The silence that had once protected Callaway now became his indictment. Inside his home office, Richard Callaway sat in a leather chair staring at a bookshelf lined with awards. His phone buzzed every few minutes. Journalists, former colleagues, old friends, even his own department chair, all either distancing themselves or quietly expressing shock. He didn't respond to any of them. He just sat, frozen. The room felt smaller than it used to. The walls, once lined with certificates and scholarly journals, now felt like a courtroom. The weight of reputation, once his greatest weapon, was now collapsing under its own architecture. He opened his laptop and checked his inbox. Hundreds of messages. But one caught his attention. It was from Jalen Moore, or rather Jalen's attorney. Short, professional. Please direct any future communication regarding our client through legal representation. Do not contact Jalen Moore directly. He closed the laptop slowly, then stood. The next day, Jalen received a message from a blocked number. He almost deleted it, but something made him pause. It wasn't a threat. It was a request. "Mr. Moore, I'm requesting a private meeting. No press. No lawyers. Just us. I have something to say that you need to hear. RC." Jalen stared at the message for a long time. Simone warned against it. Lena flat out advised. No. There's nothing he can say that changes what he did. But curiosity wasn't the reason Jalen considered it. It was clarity. Closure. The chance to stand across from the man who had tried calmly, systematically to erase him. He agreed. Under one condition. He would choose the location. They met in the old seminar room, where Jalen had given his first groundbreaking talk. The place where the projector had glitched. The place where Callaway had tried, so subtly, to shatter something he didn't build. Callaway arrived first. Dressed down. No tie. Eyes heavy. He didn't speak immediately when Jalen entered. Just nodded once, like a man trying to soften his own sharpness. Jalen sat across from him, arms folded. Callaway cleared his throat. "I didn't ask you here to debate facts. The facts are, well, they are what they are now." Jalen said nothing. Callaway continued. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what I did. For what I enabled. And for what I justified under the name of standards." Jalen didn't move. The words didn't sting. They didn't satisfy. They simply echoed. Callaway looked down. "There was a time I thought I was protecting the field, keeping it pure. I told myself that the ones who struggled just weren't meant to be here. But what I really feared was change. Challenge. You." Still, Jalen said nothing. Then Callaway looked up. "I'll resign, quietly, but I need something in return." Jalen blinked. "What?" Callaway leaned forward, the mask slipping just enough to show the desperation underneath. "Don't pursue criminal charges." Jalen stared at him. "The script, the sabotage, the data manipulation, that goes beyond academia. You know it. Your lawyer knows it. If this goes federal..." His voice trailed off. This wasn't an apology. It was a negotiation. He wasn't trying to make peace. He was trying to preserve what little he had left. Callaway tries one last move. He offers Jalen a private apology with a catch. The silence after Callaway's final sentence lingered longer than his career ever would. "Don't pursue criminal charges." Jalen looked at him. This once intimidating man, now folded in guilt, bargaining for dignity, not forgiveness, not even understanding, just preservation. He could have yelled, could have accepted the apology, and walked away with the upper hand. But instead he stood up, calm and controlled. "You don't get to choose the ending," Jalen said. "Not anymore." Calloway blinked. I'm trying to take accountability. No, Jalen said. You're trying to escape accountability. And if you really believed in truth and standards, then you'd accept the consequences the same way you expected us to accept your bias. He turned to leave, but before he stepped through the door, he looked back just once. You wanted a genius, he said. Now deal with what that actually looks like. 3 weeks later, Jalen's name appeared on the cover of the American Journal of Undergraduate Research. Title: Extending Stokes' Theorem to Non-Orientable Manifolds, a New Paradigm for Surface Integration in Real Spaces. Authors Jalen A. Moore, University, and Dr. Alan Lenner, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The peer-reviewed paper had taken months to shape, and every line bore the weight of resilience. What began as a coping mechanism, an escape from sabotage, had become a groundbreaking contribution in its field. Mathematicians from around the country began citing it in early drafts. One MIT professor wrote, "The elegance of this paper reminds me of Terence Tao's early work." It wasn't just praise. It was recognition. Jalen didn't celebrate. Not in the way people expected. No champagne, no victory posts. Just a quiet nod when Dr. Lenner called to tell him they'd been nominated for a national award. Weeks passed. Then the letter came. Congratulations. You have been selected as the recipient of the 2025 National Undergraduate Research Prize in Mathematics, awarded annually to a student whose work demonstrates extraordinary originality, clarity, and academic courage. The award includes a $15,000 research grant, a full ride to the National STEM Symposium in Washington, D.C., and publication in the Annual Review of Mathematical Sciences. He stared at the letter for a long time, not because he couldn't believe it, but because he could. For the first time, the world was seeing what had always been there. Not a token, not a protest symbol, a scholar. In the auditorium where Calloway once introduced him with thinly veiled contempt, the university now held a recognition ceremony. It wasn't optional, not anymore. Dean Rowe opened the event with her usual measured poise, but her tone carried something different this time. Weight, perhaps, or awareness. We are gathered to honor not just an exceptional student, but an exceptional moment, one that has forced us all to reckon with the invisible barriers we've allowed to stand for too long. Jalen walked across the stage slowly, quietly. As the standing ovation began, he didn't raise his hands. He didn't bow. He simply stood, because being seen wasn't the same as being validated. The award drew national attention. Interviews flooded in. PBS, NPR, The Atlantic. Every journalist wanted to talk about the student who outwrote the system. But Jalen was selective. He only gave one sit-down interview, with a nonprofit education platform focused on Black excellence in STEM. In the interview, he said something that struck a nerve.
The problem was never that we weren't brilliant. The problem was that brilliance, in a Black body, was treated like a glitch. I didn't get smarter. I got heard, and that should never require a lawsuit.
It was clipped, quoted, and spread like wildfire. Within a week, student groups at other universities began hosting academic truth panels. Professors wrote op-eds about re-evaluating peer grading systems. Even the faculty union at Jalen's university issued a resolution supporting independent oversight of grading equity. Still, Jalen stayed grounded. He split his time between campus, his research lab, and the students he mentored, quietly helping other Black underclassmen navigate the system that had tried to swallow him. One evening, as he helped a first year with a stubborn vector field proof, Simone burst into the room with her phone held high. "Turn on C-SPAN," she said, eyes wide. Jalen raised an eyebrow. "Why?" She flipped her screen around. A live congressional hearing was underway on educational equity and systemic bias in academia. The segment was titled, "The Gatekeeping Problem: How Institutions Fail Black Scholars." A woman in a gray suit sat at the witness table, speaking into the microphone. It was Lena Woods. She wasn't alone. Behind her were national education experts, civil rights leaders, and policy researchers. And on the screen beside them, projected for the entire chamber, was the title of Jalen's paper. Dr. Lenner's voice crackled through the speakers. "This paper should have been celebrated from day one. Instead, it was almost buried. That's the story of too many young Black scholars. Being exceptional isn't enough when the institution is committed to pretending you're average." A representative leaned into his mic. "And you're saying this paper, this one here, was developed under active academic sabotage?" "Yes," Lena said. "And it's not the exception, it's a pattern. We just finally had the data and the courage to confront it." The hearing went viral overnight. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about one student and one professor. It was about a system. Jalen turned off the screen, not because he was overwhelmed, but because it was finally no longer his burden alone. The paper is cited in a congressional hearing on academic racism. The auditorium was full again. Same rows, same windows, same creaking wooden seats. But this time, the back row sat empty, not from neglect, but reverence. 3 years had passed since the day Jalen Moore first slipped into that corner seat. Unnoticed, unassumed, unseen. Today there was no hiding. His name wasn't whispered. It was announced. Valedictorian of the class of 2025, Jalen Alexander Moore. The room erupted. He stepped onto the stage slowly, wearing a deep navy gown, lined with gold trim. Around his neck hung a medallion reserved for the top 1% of graduates. In his hands he carried not just a speech, but a story. Dean Rowe, now in her final year before early retirement, watched from the wings. Her face unreadable, but her eyes followed Jalen with a kind of gravity she reserved for very few. He adjusted the microphone. Silence settled like snowfall. Then he began. When I first walked into this room, I sat in the back, not because I was shy or unsure of myself. I sat there because it's where I thought people like me belonged. Out of the way, out of the spotlight, unnoticed. A murmur of recognition passed through the students. He smiled faintly. That back row taught me something. Not about calculus, about people, about power, about what happens when brilliance makes people uncomfortable. He paused, letting the words breathe. When I aced a diagnostic exam, someone marked my name, not with pride, but with suspicion. When I delivered a research breakthrough, someone tried to erase it, not because it wasn't correct, but because I wasn't.
No one shifted.
No one blinked. They called it standards. They called it tradition. But what it really was fear. Fear that someone they underestimated might be undeniable. Behind him, the large projector screen faded in and out with photos from the past 4 years. His seminar, the protest, the court sketch, the journal cover, and finally, the blueprint for a new university mentorship program, the Moore Initiative for Equity in STEM. Jalen turned back to the audience. I didn't stand up here today just because I fought back. I stand here because I had proof, not just mathematical, but moral. Truth is not passive. You have to prove it, again and again, especially when they try to discredit the variables you're made of. His voice softened. To every student who was told they weren't ready, to every black scholar whose intelligence was filtered through bias before it was recognized. This moment is yours too. This diploma doesn't erase what we went through, but it's a record, a receipt, a reminder. The crowd stood slowly at first, then all at once. He closed his folder, looked toward the back row, then back at the sea of standing faces. And with one final breath, he said, they tried to erase a mind, but he solved their equation. The room thundered with applause, and somewhere in the shadows, in the aisle near the back, a young freshman, black, nervous, unsure, sat in the very same seat Jalen had once claimed, clutching a notebook, watching, taking notes. No one should have to record their worth just to be believed. No one should lose opportunities because of the color of their skin. If this story made you feel something, don't let it fade. Type yes if you believe in justice. Subscribe if you've seen this happen too often.